Laura clip for you. On Thursday night, she brought on Cathy Areu and Malkin to give their thoughts on the affirmative action lawsuit filed against Harvard by the nonprofit group Students for Fair Admissions. The original suit was actually filed back in 2014 and litigation has been ongoing, but the reason it made the headlines last week is because the Justice Department filed a statement of interest supporting the plaintiff against Harvard. There's a lot at stake here regarding the constitutionality of affirmative action, so let's roll the clip and then we've got quite a bit of post-analysis for this one.
Harvard in the hot seat. Ooh. What happens when Harvard University capped the number of Asian students who could be admitted? Well, that didn't go down so well. Malkin joining us, and of course from CRTV, and Cathy Areu, the publisher of Catalina magazine. Also, we have news from Betsy DeVos at the Education Department involving Title IX and sexual harassment on college campuses. But let's start with this Harvard story. Michelle, you have been all over this issue of affirmative action for years, and now we're at the point where we're penalizing Asian students, and thankfully the U.S. Department of Justice stepped in on behalf of fairness and merit on behalf of these Asian students. Tell us what you know.
Yeah, this blatant racial discrimination in the name of so-called social justice has punished high-achieving Asian American students for a long time. It's been obvious since the late 1980s and 1990s when I was in college. And finally, we have the Trump Justice Department siding with equality of opportunity as opposed to equality of outcome. And what I love most about what's happening, Laura, is Harvard is squirming under the microscope and the bright, glaring sunlight of discovery. For the longest time, they have kept their racially conscious and race unneutral policies under wraps, and now it's being exposed. And what's happening is you have a lot of liberal Asian Americans who are finally having second thoughts about the social engineering that has punished them at the expense of equality of opportunity. And look, it makes absolutely no sense to punish the children of legal immigrants from all over Asia as some sort of social justice recompense to black students. The reparations foundation of affirmative action here has been totally blown up.
All right, let's go to Cathy. We're a really short segment here. Cathy, if it's just a merit-based analysis on admissions, the study from the Center for Equal Opportunity shows that Asian Americans would have 43% of the admissions, right. Hispanics 2%, African Americans on merit, according to the Center for Equal Opportunity, just 1%.
Right. I mean, and what is merit? I mean, is merit meaning SATs? Is it meaning test scores? So what we're trying to say, this is against affirmative action. And what's happening is that Harvard actually has a system where their school population is diverse. So the Trump administration is trying to take away diversity at our institutions like Harvard. Harvard is fighting for diversity so that our student body can look like our demographics in our country. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Alright, so obviously Laura was pressed for time here. Michelle and Cathy got in a few basic talking points, but to be honest, there wasn't a whole lot of substance. You got Cathy asking if SATs and test scores count as merit, and then Michelle saying that Harvard is squirming under the microscope, which they aren't. They have a ton of support behind them, lots of money, and a formidable legal team. But not to worry, guys, we'll give you a proper breakdown of this issue. And before I begin, we do want to apologize for taking 3 full days to make this video. The research involved for this one was quite extensive. The initial complaint by Students for Fair Admissions, which I'll refer to as the plaintiff, was about 120 pages. We also read through the recent motions for summary judgment by each side and the Justice Department statement of interest from last week. And to supplement the official case filings, we also reviewed a bunch of editorials weighing in on this debate as part of our due diligence. So hopefully this will be a quality, worthwhile video for you guys. Alright, let's start with the initial complaint, which was again filed in 2014. The lawsuit is alleging that Harvard's affirmative action program has violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funds or other federal financial assistance. And Harvard, like most universities, is subject to Title VI because despite having a private endowment of over $30 billion, they still accept $10 to $20 million a year in federal funds, and they also disperse federally backed student loans. So I'll read now the opening paragraph of the complaint just to get us oriented. This is an action brought under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit Harvard from engaging in intentional discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. Classifications of citizens solely on the basis of race are by their very nature odious to a free people whose institutions are founded upon the doctrine of equality. They threaten to stigmatize individuals by reason of their membership in a racial group and to incite racial hostility. As a consequence, racial classifications are highly disfavored and have been permitted only when there is a compelling government interest that cannot be met through race-neutral means. In the educational setting, diversity is the only interest the Supreme Court has found compelling. Even then, the Supreme Court has mandated strict judicial scrutiny to ensure that an academic institution is actually pursuing that interest and that it is absolutely necessary to employ racial preferences in order to achieve a diverse student body. Alright, so essentially the court has previously ruled that diversity is a compelling interest for educational institutions to pursue, and that these institutions may employ racial preferences if and only if they are absolutely necessary in order to achieve said diversity. So this is a key element of the case because the plaintiffs are arguing that there are perfectly good race-neutral alternatives to achieving diversity, such as considering applicants' socioeconomic status instead of their race, as well as expanding financial aid, scholarships, and recruiting efforts to attract more diverse applicants, and also eliminating long-standing admissions practices such as preferential consideration of legacy students that selectively disadvantage minority applicants, since most legacies, their parents attended Harvard back in the day when the school was predominantly white, and so naturally there are a lot more white students today who have that legacy status that they can leverage in admissions. Alright, so that's one piece of the argument, that Harvard does not need to use race-conscious admissions policies in order to obtain a sufficiently diverse student body. And don't ask us what that translates to numerically. None of the schools in these affirmative actions cases ever provide specific numbers for optimal diversity. They just use broad language like we want to achieve a critical mass. But anyway, the central claim of this case is that Harvard's admissions policy is discriminatory against Asian Americans in violation of Title VI. So what evidence is there to support that claim? Well, the complaint actually cites a lot of supporting evidence. We'll link it for you below with the other court filings, but I'll just go through a few noteworthy examples. First thing to mention is that Harvard used to publish acceptance rates by ethnicity, but recently they've stopped doing that even though other schools like the UC system continue to provide that data to the public. I'll let you speculate as to why Harvard stopped, but moving on to the data, let's start with the SAT scores. The authoritative study on the role of race in elite undergraduate admissions was conducted by Princeton professors Thomas Espenshade and Alexandra Radford back in 2005 and then published in their book in 2009. And what they discovered is that in order to get into these elite schools, Asian Americans had to score on average 140 points higher on SATs than whites, 270 points higher than Latinos, and 450 points higher than blacks. And so this is on the old 1600 scale, not the current 2400 scale. And this particular stat gets cited all the time in affirmative action discussions, and it's a pretty profound finding. I imagine it's very stressful for Asian American high school students knowing that just to have a chance at one of these schools, they have to perform that much better on standardized exams just because of their race. Here's another revealing stat. This is the Asian American enrollment at the 8 Ivy League schools, including Harvard, for years 2007 to 2013. You can see that they all keep their percentage of Asian Americans remarkably consistent year after year, about 16.5% on average. And obviously you're not going to see such little variance unless this is intentional. Harvard and the other Ivies have said over and over that they don't use quota systems, which were deemed unconstitutional in a 1978 Supreme Court ruling, but then you see enrollment data like this year over year. Now let's contrast this data with other prestigious schools that don't employ race-conscious admissions, such as Caltech. You can see that over time, Caltech's percentage of Asian Americans has shot up to almost 45%, while Harvard's has stayed constant. Again, Harvard says they don't have quotas, but if you don't have quotas and you don't employ race-conscious admissions, this is what you should see in terms of Asian American enrollment. Caltech has a very different institutional mission than Harvard. All Caltech cares about is academic achievement. They're not looking to build a diverse class in an effort to provide a holistic liberal arts education. They just want the nerdiest math and science geeks who are willing to come live in Pasadena for 4 years and pump out a bunch of research output, and so they don't mind loading up on Asians. Same with the UC system, which banned racial preferences in admission back in 1996 by a popular referendum. They now have over 30% Asian American students. So clearly it follows that if Harvard were to get rid of race-conscious admissions, the percent of Asian Americans should increase, and the plaintiffs estimate that it should be as high as 40%. And guys, here's what's really got the plaintiffs upset in this case. They are claiming that Harvard uses very sinister review criteria in order to reject a lot of their high-achieving Asian American applicants. And I don't want to make light of this issue, but it is a little funny. So Harvard apparently rates applicants on their personality, on their personal qualities, and the plaintiffs argue that Harvard consistently rates Asian American candidates below whites and other ethnicities on these personality metrics. And so now the Asian American community is acutely aware of what they're up against in trying to get into these elite schools, and it's created this entire industry catered towards helping them sort of game the system to avoid being stereotyped and improving their admissions odds. So here's some advice from the Princeton Review. If you are an Asian American, or even if you simply have an Asian or Asian sounding surname, you need to be careful about what you do and don't say in your application. Now I'm going to read you some of these because it's pretty ridiculous that this is a thing. You need to avoid being an Asian Joe Blogs. Asian Joe Blogs is an Asian American applicant with a very high math SAT score, a low or mediocre verbal SAT score, and so on. The more you sound like this person, the more likely admissions officers will be to treat you as part of the Asian invasion and reject your application, or at the very least make you compete against other Asian applicants with similar characteristics rather than against the applicant pool as a whole. If you're given an option, don't attach a photograph to your application, and don't answer the optional question about your ethnic background. This is especially important if you don't have an Asian-sounding surname. By the same token, if you do have an Asian-sounding surname but aren't Asian, do attach a photograph. Do not write your application essay about the importance of your family or the positive negative aspects of living in two cultures. These are Asian Joe Blogs topics and they are incredibly popular. Instead, write about something entirely unrelated to your ethnic background. I mean, guys, no wonder they're pissed, right? You have to feel for them. They've had the aptly named Tiger parents working them nonstop since preschool in order to be as intelligent, talented, and competitive as they can possibly be, and then they gotta deal with all of this nonsense. So hopefully by now you appreciate that Asian Americans have arguably the toughest path when it comes to elite undergrad admissions. And for sure, a part of this is because of affirmative action policies that lower academic standards for the underrepresented minorities, namely Hispanics, Native Americans, and African Americans. And people like to zero in on this because they see the SAT score comparisons, but in reality, affirmative action is only part of the problem if we are going to call this a problem. So this article published in The Observer actually explains the entirety of it pretty well. It explains how Harvard's applicants are not actually compared against each other, but they're first segregated into discrete applicant pools, and then within those pools, Harvard tries to select the best available. So here's how it breaks down. About 50% of a highly selective college's entering class will be admitted solely on academic potential. The admissions committee will be sensitive to finding kids with great academic potential for just about every academic department. And guys, this is an important point because Harvard does have to make sure that there's enough students going into each of the various departments to fill up those classes. And I think it definitely works against the high-achieving Asian American applicants that so many of them are pursuing narrow interests in STEM fields, pre-med, engineering in a very disproportionate manner relative to other ethnicities. And Harvard can only take so many biology majors. But moving on, about 20% of the entering class will be recruited athletes, and then legacies will be another 12 to 13%. Also celebrity kids, sons and daughters of famous people, presidents, foreign leaders, they all fall into this VIP category, which is its own separate applicant pool. And I think we can all appreciate this point. Applicants whose families can afford to endow buildings and professorships while few in number are high in clout. Which is basically to say that the VIP group is safe, and then the last special interest pool is of course the underrepresented minorities who benefit from affirmative action. And so here's the conclusion drawn by this author. Without a particular special interest tag, smart kids compete within the academic niche, basically against each other. That's why the Asian American Coalition's complaint is flawed. It assumes that the Asian American kids are competing against blacks and Hispanics. They're not. Without a special interest tag, they're competing against all just smart kids, mainly each other. And I think that's a correct description of how these elite schools actually handle admissions. But in terms of the present lawsuit, the question about Title VI can only apply to racial discrimination. Title VI doesn't protect against discrimination for not being a legacy, a VIP, or an athlete. And all of these groups do get a significant boost. A former Dartmouth admissions officer wrote in the New York Times that for a school with a 15% overall admission rate, legacies might get in at 35%, recruited athletes at 80%, and underrepresented minorities at closer to 90%, which is pretty remarkable. And so to wrap things up, my question for you guys is, which of these special applicant pools do you think should be done away with, if at all? And do consider this Dartmouth admissions officer's perspective. I understand why it pays to give legacies a boost. They foster family pride and tradition, school spirit, increase giving by dedicated alums who also volunteer their time. I have more of an issue with the number of recruited athletes. In my opinion, 20% of the class is too high, and football is largely to blame because of its huge roster. Many of these athletes come in well below the standard for the school. Legacies are typically much more academically qualified compared to the top recruited athletes who can get into Harvard with C grades and 500 SAT scores if they throw a football or are good with a hockey puck. And personally, I agree with this. Outside of the alumni base, I don't think there would be much of a public uproar if Harvard and the entire Ivy League decided to dissolve their athletic programs that nobody watches in order to open up more spots for merit-based admissions. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think that the Asian Americans have a legitimate case in this lawsuit? Do you think that they're perhaps upset at the wrong interest group? Personally, I think Harvard is overrated anyway. I mean, just learning about how their admissions process actually works has devalued their degree in my book. I think these kids will do just fine no matter where they go to college, so long as they continue to compete and work hard and stay in the STEM fields where they can actually get a job, as opposed to taking out $250K for a Harvard gender studies degree. Alright, this was our longest video so far, but hopefully you'll agree it was necessary for discussing such a complex and contentious topic. We do rely 100% on your support to fund this channel, so please consider donating if you find our work to be of value. The links for that are all below in the description, and I'll see y'all in the next video.